welcome one and all, I'm Alexis, aka The Sloth Reader, and I'm here today to tell you guys all about my favorite books that I read in 2018. These are not in any order except for the last two I'm going to mention. Honestly, they're just in order of kind of how I read them throughout the year, starting with the one that I read first and then going through. So because of that, like I said, they're just in the order that I read them throughout the year, except for the last two, which are my favorite two books of the year. That kind of hold their own spots for a reason. So yeah, I'm just gonna go ahead and get into it. I have 10 books that I read and absolutely adored this year, so let's get started. The first book I'm gonna mention I read back in January, and it's the second book in one of my favorite series. It's my favorite book in the series without a doubt, and that is Lair of Dreams by Libba Bray. I think this is actually most people's least favorite book in the series, but hands down it's my favorite book in the series. This series to me is just so special and unique, and it just really hits on all cylinders. You know, it's a little spooky. It really does a great job with characters and the plot and the world building, and I just really adore the characters in the series, and I love seeing them all struggle and grow, and this is just one of my favorite series. Honestly, it's perfect for me, which is what I'm going to say about a lot of stuff that's on this, but kids with superpowers is one of my favorite tropes. I love the found family trope of a bunch of people like coming together from different backgrounds, which is very much what the Diviner series is. Plus, it takes place in 1920s, and the setting is so much fun to read. The Diviners was on my list last year, and with no surprise, Lair of Dreams made it onto my list this year as well. The next book I'm going to mention was the first book by this author I had read, and I fell head over heels in love with it, honestly. It's definitely, without a doubt, one of my probably top 5 YA contemporaries, and that is Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. This is a story that so beautifully portrays platonic love and how you don't have to be romantically involved with someone to love them so much and to care so much about them. But this book also just has 2 fantastically diverse main characters. Both main characters are queer. One character is demisexual, another is bisexual. Our main character, Francis, is also part Ethiopian, I believe is what it is. Plus you have several other really diverse side characters, and I just really loved the characters in this book and the plot. But this book also heavily focuses on what it's like to have an online community you're a part of, what it's like to be a creator on the online community, and it also tackles toxicity in an online community, and it just does it so perfectly. You can tell Alice Oseman grew up in that era of being online and being parts of fandoms and communities and what it's really like, and it's easily the best portrayal of that I've ever read in a book. And just, again, like, the characters, the story, the message, it's all there, and I just absolutely adore this book. The next book I'm going to mention is another book that I would describe as being just perfect for me, and that was Nevernight by Jay Kristoff. I went into this book very scared that I wasn't going to enjoy the writing, and the writing easily became my favorite thing about it. Yes, I love the characters. Yes, I love the talking cat, Mr. Kindly. Yes, I love the death and the sex and everything, but I love the writing. The writing adds so much world building to the story, and the writing adds so much lore to this world, and I just adore it. And I think that Mia Corvair is a very easy character to root for. I think that she's bad, but she's also a little good sometimes, and I just really fell in love with her journey, and I'm so excited to see where she goes from here. And yeah, I honestly just fell in love with Nevernight from like the first page, which was a nice surprise because I went into this thinking I wasn't going to love it as much as I did. The next one I'm going to mention is actually the only kind of non-fiction-y book that made this list this year, but it still made my list, and that was Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. I loved this book. I've talked about it before, but part of the reason I loved this book so much was the reading experience. I listened to it on audiobook, and it's narrated by Neil Gaiman, and he does just an incredible job bringing Norse mythology to life, bringing these old stories to life, and this has been the year of Norse mythology for me. I've had so many little other pieces of media that I've enjoyed this year that are related to Norse mythology, and so being able to see all of these stories brought together in a collection by a writer who is very talented, but also someone who's talented at narration as well, just really sold it to me, and I'm so excited to read more Neil Gaiman in the future. But honestly, this was probably the most fun I had reading a book this year, because I just utterly had so much fun, and for me that alone is enough to put it on my list. The next book I'm going to mention is the biggest surprise on this list. It's the one I picked it up more as like a random pick. Literally, I pulled it out of my TBR jar, and I never in a million years thought this would be one of my favorite books I read this year. I never in a million years thought this book would mean as much to me as it does, but here we are. And that is Out of the Easy by Ruta Sepetys. This is probably the book that has made me feel like most at home this year. It's the book that weirdly enough has like represented such a weird part of me. This book takes place in 1950s New Orleans. And if you guys don't know, I'm from New Orleans. It's a town that will always be very near and dear to my heart because I just love it so much. And this book just captured it so perfectly. Like, I had to look up whether or not Ruta Sepetys lived there because I was like, there's no way an outsider could so perfectly capture what it's like to be in New Orleans. And then she wrote this afterword that's part of the audiobook that literally had me in tears because she talked about, like, the process of writing the story and the research she did, and it's so well researched, and, like, someone who's from there, like, I'm a native, like, it felt like I was back home walking these streets that I've walked my entire life and reading about these events that I've heard about my entire life. Plus, I just really loved the main character, Josie. She was very flawed, but it felt so human and realistic, and I found myself rooting for her, and I found myself being sad for her, and I found myself wanting to know what was going to happen to her. And there's a queer side character that I heavily fell in love with. It's definitely not the best queer representation, and I'll be the first person to say that, but, like, being a queer girl from New Orleans, like, I loved this book so much. It meant the world to me to read it this year, and I'm so ready to reread it at some point in the future. The next book on this list is another surprise because I never thought I was gonna love this series as much as I've come to love this series, especially given my history with this author. And that is Lord of Shadows by Cassandra Clare. I guess a lot of my friends prefer Lady Midnight, but I definitely preferred Lord of Shadows to Lady Midnight. Yes, this book is very big. Yes, it probably could have been shorter, but I genuinely just enjoyed every second of this book. Without a doubt, my favorite characters in the series are Mark, Christina, and Kieran, and I adored how much of this book focused on them and the weird love triangle polyamory situation going on between the three of them, because I loved every second of it. I loved getting to know Kieran more. I loved getting to hear more about Christina's past and her dreams, and I just loved getting to see Mark assimilate back into his regular life again, and I loved this book. I am not the biggest fan of the Emma Julian drama, which is why I didn't love Lady Midnight, because I kind of got over that real fast. So I loved that this book focused so much more on just Emma and Julian, which is why I think I love Lord of Shadows as much as I do. I can't believe that I'm utter trash for the Dark Artifices, considering that I've had a very rocky relationship with Cassandra Clare's books in the past, but I am legitimate trash for the Dark Artifices series, and I haven't read Queen of Air and Darkness yet, but believe me that it'll get read very quickly in 2019, because Lord of Shadows was just an absolute gem, and I cannot wait to continue on. The next book I'm going to mention is one I 100% knew was going to make my list this year, and it did, and that is Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. I read both Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom this year, and I enjoyed Six of Crows, but I knew as soon as I finished it that I was going to love every second of Crooked Kingdom, and I did. I adore the characters in the series. I've said it from the first Grisha book I read, but I love the Grisha universe so much. I am just so in love with every detail I get to know about it. I loved some of the cameos we get in this book from characters that we're going to see more of in the future. I loved seeing more of the characters and their backstories and their dreams and where they're going to go in the future. Jesper is still hands down my favorite character in this series. I am a sucker for Jesper, but I cried reading this book when I was reading some of Wyland's chapters, and through the course of this book I came to really connect to certain aspects of Wyland's character. Thank God I don't have a father like like Wylan does, but other aspects of Wylan's character, of his personality and kind of the way he views the world and the way he views himself, I like very heavily came to identify with, and I loved that. I loved that I fell so in love with these characters over the course of 2 books, and it's just really well written. This book is much more well paced, I think, than Six of Crows is, and overall I just really loved this book. I'm so glad I finally picked the series up this year because it's just as good in my opinion as everybody says it is, and this was just really, really fun and I loved it. The next one I'm going to mention is one I also haven't talked about in a wrap-up yet because I read it in December, and that was The Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. This is one, again, that I wasn't expecting to love as much as I did. I knew I would like this book. Robin Hobb's books are very well loved. They're, you know, a huge commitment and process, but I knew I would like it. I never expected to love it. And the main reason I fell so in love with this book is because I fell so in love with the main character Fitz. I loved reading about Fitz. I loved reading his thoughts and his actions and his decisions, and I loved following his story. I loved a lot of the side characters for sure, but Fitz was the real star of the show for me. Like, I just want to follow Fitz, like, over and over through so many more adventures, and I'm so thankful I get to do that. Thank you, Robin Hobb. But I'm also just really fascinated by the Six Duchies as a world, and I'm very intrigued to learn more about the magic and the politics, and I just really fell in love with The Assassin's Apprentice. I wasn't expecting to, but I very much did. Coming down to my last 2 books I'm going to mention, the next one I'm going to mention is what I consider objectively to be the best book I read this year, and then the other one is subjectively my favorite book I read this year. My second favorite book I read this year, the book that I consider the best book I read this year, it's going to be a book that's on a lot of people's favorites list. It was on a lot of people's favorites lists last year, and that is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I don't feel like there's anything I can say about this book that hasn't already been said, because honestly, it's beautiful. The main character, Evelyn, is so incredibly unlikable at times, and yet you can't help rooting for her, and you can't help wanting her to succeed and wanting her to be happy. And the amount of queer characters in this story, and the different ways that they're portrayed, but also, like, their connections to one another, and the twists in this book, and just how it's told through Evelyn Hugo's 7 husbands as like a storytelling method, and just Monique's role in all of it. I just loved everything about this book. Again, I don't feel like there's anything more I can say other than I can't recommend reading a book about a Cuban-American bisexual Hollywood starlet enough, because it's just as fun and sad and dramatic as it sounds like it's going to be, and it's just so enjoyable. And moving on to the last book I'm going to mention, my favorite book of 2018. It's, again, one you've definitely heard me talk about before, because this is one that I knew I was going to like, but I never expected to love. And I haven't honestly stopped thinking about it from the moment I read it. And I just wish I could shove this book into every person's hands because it's just so good. And that is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. This is a book about our main character, Celie, who is so incredibly well written, and she goes through so many hardships in her life, but I've never read a character who is more hopeful, who is more thriving, who learns to overcome these obstacles with such grace as much as Celie does, as much as Celie is. And I fell head over heels in love with her, and I feel like her story is so unique because she's a queer black woman in the American South in the early 1900s, and that's such a unique voice, and Celie provides such a unique look into, you know, her life. But I also really loved the story going on with the other characters. I fell in love with a lot of side characters. I loved how incredibly flawed Celie's relationships were with other people. And yet, again, the grace with which Celie handles everything in her life is so inspiring and beautiful. And I just, like, I love this book so much. And I never expected it to take up such a giant piece in my heart the way it has. And it's told in letters, and just that whole thing of it being told in letters and how things shift over the course of the novel. If you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. It's just beautiful. I can't think of any other way to describe it than being just a beautiful novel, an inspiring novel, a novel that is very well written, that features a main character who is just, in a word, incredible. And I loved this book. I love this book. This has become one of my favorite books, and I never expected it to, and it took my breath away when I read it. And I haven't stopped thinking about it the entire year, and I already want to reread it like every day because I just love this book so incredibly much. Like, I can't gush about it enough. Like, it's so good. It was a winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. And look at Alice Walker. Do you want to let this woman down by not reading her book? Just do it. Read the book. Alrighty guys, so those are my favorite reads of 2018. It's a very interesting stack because there's some historical fiction, there's a lot of fantasy, there's some literary fiction, there's contemporary, but I feel like that's a really good summation of my reading tastes in general because I like to read things that cover heavy topics, and I feel like every book that made my list this year in some way does, but they all do them in different ways, and they're all very diverse reads, which is perfect for me. Again, best way to sum up my tastes. But I really loved a lot of the books I read this year, but without a doubt, these are the 10 that I loved the most. I would absolutely love to know what was your favorite book you read in 2018. You can leave that down in the comments below. Hopefully I'll get some nice recommendations. If you like what I do, I try to upload 2 videos every week, and I'll see you guys soon with another one.